The Bear River Massacre, the history and legacy of the U.S. Army's most notorious attack on the Shoshone in the Pacific Northwest. Written by Charles River editors. Narrated by Jim D. Johnston. Table of Contents. Introduction. Rising Tensions. Contact with the Shoshone. The Beginning of the End. The Bear River Massacre. The Legacy of the Bear River Massacre. Introduction. It is said that Colonel Connor is determined to exterminate the Indians who have been killing the immigrants on the route to the gold mines in Washington Territory. Small detachments have been leaving for the north for several days. If the present expedition copies the doings of the other that preceded it, it will result in catching some friendly Indians, murdering them, and setting the guilty scamps remain undisturbed in their mountain haunts. George A. Smith, Journal History of the LDS Church. From the Trail of Tears to Wounded Knee and Little Bighorn, the narrative of American history is incomplete without the inclusion of the Native Americans that lived on the continent before European settlers arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. Since the first contact between natives and settlers, tribes like the Sioux, Cherokee, and Navajo have both fascinated and perplexed outsiders with their history, language, and culture. From 1804 to 1806, the first American expedition across the North American continent was commissioned by President Thomas Jefferson, who had recently bought a vast swath of territory from France. Though he knew he had bought a huge amount of land, Jefferson wasn't entirely sure of what he had bought, so he asked a team led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark to traverse the continent until they reached the Pacific, studying everything from the ecology to geography along the way to get an understanding of the country's new region. Lewis and Clark would find far more than they anticipated. The 33 members who made the trip came into contact with about 24 Native American tribes, and none were more important than the Shoshone, who the expedition referred to as Snake Indians. Of course, the most famous Shoshone was Sacagawea, who had been captured by the Hidastas before accompanying Lewis and Clark to help guide them west. The Shoshone led the expedition when it was on the brink of starvation and took them in as guests during the journey. The Shoshone are still remembered for their assistance, especially Sacagawea, and they maintained contact with Americans throughout the 19th century. But unfortunately, the cooperation gave way to conflict as white settlers began to move westward and enter onto lands occupied by the Shoshone. In 1862, California officials sent the Third California Volunteer Infantry under the command of Colonel Patrick Connor to construct a fort, Fort Douglas, in the foothills of the Wasatch Mountains above Salt Lake City, in an effort to keep lines of communication open so pioneers would not be hesitant about settling in the region. Meanwhile, Shoshone Chief Bear Hunter, Wirasuap, led his band on raids against mining camps and Mormon settlements. In January 1863, Colonel Connor led 300 volunteers out of the newly completed Fort Douglas through 140 miles of bitter cold to reach Chief Bear Hunter's camp on the eastern shore of the Great Salt Lake, culminating in what would become known as the Bear River Massacre at Preston, Idaho. During the fighting, Connor's men trapped and killed an estimated 350 to 500 Northwestern Shoshone, including women, children, and the elderly. According to William Hull, a local settler sent to look for survivors, after killing most of the men and many of the children, they raped and assaulted the women. In some cases, soldiers held the feet of infants by the heel and beat their brains out on any hard substance they could find. Women who resisted the soldiers were shot and killed. Never will I forget the scene. Dead bodies were everywhere. I counted 8 deep in one place, and in several places they were 3 to 5 deep. All in all, we counted nearly 400, 2/3 of this number being women and children. We found 2 Indian women alive whose thighs had been broken by the bullets. 2 little boys and 1 little girl about 3 years of age were still living. The little girl was badly wounded, having 8 flesh wounds in her body. This would be the highest number of fatalities suffered by the Shoshone at the hands of the U.S. military. but the fighting was far from over. Capitalizing on their victory, which effectively ended what had been widely reported as Wirasuap's warpath, the federal government approved an open claim on the most hospitable lands of the Great Basin, leaving the Shoshone with the understanding that their lands would soon be lost to white ranchers, farmers, and prospectors. The Shoshone would continue to oppose American soldiers during the Snake War, a reference to Americans' collective term for the Northern Paiute, Bannock, and Western Shoshone bands living along the Snake River in Oregon, Nevada, California, and Idaho Territory, but most of the Shoshone's resistance ended by 1865. By the time the Shoshone had been relegated to reservation life, there were fewer than 5,000 members left. The Bear River Massacre, the history and legacy of the U.S. Army's most notorious attack on the Shoshone in the Pacific Northwest, looks at the chain of events that led to one of the most notorious attacks of the 19th century on the frontier. Along with pictures depicting important people, places, and events, you will learn about the Bear River Massacre like never before. Rising tensions. By the time he came to office as the third president, Thomas Jefferson had long worried about the future of the western U.S., seeing that settlements in the Ohio Valley and lower South relied upon the Mississippi River. France's controls over the region, in his estimation, put the U.S. at a severe disadvantage. His solution proved successful beyond his wildest imagination, for Napoleon did not only sell New Orleans to the U.S., the portion that Jefferson instructed his ministers to make an offer on, but all of New France, the entire area of Louisiana. Jefferson might have said later that his purchase of the territory strained but did not break the Constitution, but also should have boasted that, with one stroke, he had removed one less obstacle to American expansionism. The Louisiana Purchase encompassed all or part of 15 current U.S. states and 2 Canadian provinces, including Arkansas, Missouri, Iowa, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, parts of Minnesota that were west of the Mississippi River, most of North Dakota, nearly all of South Dakota, northeastern New Mexico, northern Texas, the portions of Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado east of the Continental Divide, and Louisiana west of the Mississippi River, including the city of New Orleans. Parts of this area were still claimed by Spain at the time of the purchase. In addition, the purchase contained small portions of land that would eventually become part of the Canadian provinces of Alberta and Saskatchewan. The purchase, which doubled the size of the United States, still comprises around 23% of current U.S. territory. The purchase was a vital moment in Jefferson's presidency. At the time, it faced domestic opposition as being possibly unconstitutional, and though he felt that the U.S. Constitution did not contain any provisions for acquiring territory, Jefferson decided to purchase Louisiana because he felt uneasy about France and Spain having the power to block American trade access. Jefferson also decided to allow slavery in the acquired territory, which laid the foundation for the crisis of the Union a half-century later. On the other hand, Napoleon Bonaparte was looking for ways to finance his empire's expansion, and he also had geopolitical motives for the deal. Upon completion of the agreement, Bonaparte stated, "This accession of territory affirms forever the power of the United States, and I have given England a maritime rival who sooner or later will humble her pride." The purchase also allowed Jefferson to plan something he had talked about since taking office, an expedition deep into the unmapped and largely unknown continent, with the final destination being the Pacific Ocean. Even before the Louisiana Purchase, and against the advice of those who expected that France and Spain would object, Jefferson had already planned to send Meriwether Lewis and a team through the lands claimed by France and Spain. The historical body of scholarship is united in its appraisal of how the political climate in 1803 complicated Jefferson's request. He had asked Congress to authorize a military reconnaissance into unknown lands that already were claimed by the 2 most powerful nations in the world, France and Britain, with a third, Spain, clinging to a hold in the south and far west. Jefferson already had approached Spanish officials administering the region on behalf of France, seeking their approval to pass through the Louisiana Territory for the purposes of exploration. Spanish Ambassador Don Carlos Martinez objected, but Jefferson pressed ahead with his request to Congress. With the Louisiana Territory squarely in American possession, Jefferson could now embark upon his great plan. In their own way, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark could bring something to the expedition that would offset the problems Jefferson saw developing in America's Wild West of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Between the Appalachians and the Mississippi, Americans rapidly filled up the land, and historians have taken note about the state of the colonists in the region. The 500,000 Americans, 1 out of 10, who already lived west of the Appalachian Mountains, however, felt they had found their own national interests. Since water routes were viewed as a source of commerce, many people along the Mississippi viewed themselves as the seeds of an independent nation that would tap into the world marketplace, not by going east to the Atlantic seaboard, but by following the Ohio and Mississippi River system down to the Gulf of Mexico. Thus, Jefferson was anxious about the American settlers on the frontier who might drift away from the Republic. Kingmakers and men of destiny would prove to be the worst thing the U.S. faced, and his own vice president, Aaron Burr, would serve as the most stunning example. But of even greater concern was the quality of American settlements in the West. Jefferson wanted to spread American civilization and Republican institutions, not merely seed the wilderness with American stock. The way to approach the problem was to enrich the fortunes of the American settlers of this vast new territory. He had meant to do that by taking control of the Mississippi and New Orleans, knowing that their fortunes lay with access to trade and the ability to sell their products. It's hard to determine exactly what Jefferson had in mind with Native Americans, especially what he thought of their future, and perhaps what challenges they might present to an expanded republic. However, he still had to deal with the present. The West was not simply a blank slate during the early years of the Republic. The Indian peoples who inhabited the region constituted formidable obstacles to the progress of American settlement. But they also possessed invaluable information about the continent and its resources that Jefferson and his countrymen sought to exploit. Thus, from 1804 to 1806, the first expedition across the North American continent was commissioned by Jefferson and led by Lewis and Clark to traverse the continent until they reached the Pacific, studying everything from the ecology to geography along the way to get an understanding of the country's new region. In fact, Lewis and Clark would find far more than they bargained for. The 33 men who made the trip came into contact with about 24 Native American tribes, many of whom helped the men survive the journey, and along the way they met and were assisted by the famous Sacagawea, who would become one of the expedition's most famous participants. Though they suffered deaths on their way west, the group ultimately reached the Pacific coast and got back to St. Louis in 1806, having drawn up nearly 150 maps and giving America a good idea of much of what lay west. On the return journey, a month or so was spent on the Columbia Plateau waiting for the way to be cleared of snow. The impact of this visit must have been profound, and at some point William Clark appears to have evangelized among the local tribes, because for the next quarter of a century, stories of the encounter were circulated and repeated until the narrative became almost supernatural. Oral tales circulated among natives in the region spoke of an anticipated return of Clark and the Great Book. It was in search of Clark and the book that brought a Native American delegation to St. Louis, but only one member, Rabbit Skin Leggings, survived the journey to report back to his people. That report was not about the return of Clark, who they did not meet, and it offered no revelations about the Great Book. Rabbit Skin Leggings told them that many white men were preparing to travel to the area. As whites began making their way to the Pacific Northwest, they were entering land inhabited almost solely by natives and traders. The fur trade had its tensions, but for many years, traders and natives worked out their own systems, times, and traditions, allowing many different groups to interact and even compete without issues that led to war. Though native groups sometimes found themselves in conflicts based on long-standing rivalries or relations with the Europeans, most of the fur traders, the trappers, the Indians, and Hudson's Bay Company officials lived peaceably. The great amount of distance from one another in this land of millions of miles likely helped to alleviate tensions. When a new vision for the Hudson's Bay Company came about, one where settlers, not itinerants, would be responsible for the colony, the rules changed. In time, the Hudson's Bay Company began to operate like a virtual empire within an empire, and it held an almost absolute monopoly on trade across most of British North America. From the 1780s onward, however, it faced vigorous competition from a new rival in the form of the Northwest Company of Montreal. Blocked out of the most lucrative fur regions of British North America, the Northwest Company established itself in the Pacific Northwest and pushed aggressively westward, creating the first European settlements and outposts among the native tribes of the Columbia Territory. In part, President Jefferson's objective in sponsoring the Lewis and Clark expedition was to find a way to direct this growing trade into the United States, rather than north into British territory or west across the ocean. As Lewis and Clark returned to St. Louis, the Northwest Company was already exploring New Caledonia, comprising most of modern-day British Columbia. None of this was formal British territory, of course, but, along with most of the coast above the 42nd parallel, it formed part of Britain's claim, and the companies active therein tended to reinforce this fact. In 1808, Northwest Company explorer Alexander Mackenzie traced the Great Canadian River, now bearing his name, to the Arctic Ocean, disappointed that it did not empty, as expected, into the Pacific Ocean. This, however, was further incentive to look south and west, and at about the same time, Northwest Company trader and explorer David Thompson undertook a series of journeys of exploration that opened up a vast new territory comprising the upper Columbia River, British Columbia, Idaho, and Montana. From the other direction came the first significant figure representing American commerce, John Jacob Astor, a brash German immigrant destined to become the wealthiest man in America. At the age of 17, Astor moved to London to work for his eldest brother, George, a manufacturer of musical instruments. 3 years later, he departed for the U.S. to seek his fortune, in possession of a few flutes and $25. Arriving at the port of Baltimore, he soon migrated north to New York City to join his brother Henry. In 1785, he married Sarah Cox Todd, with whom he would raise 7 children. In the following year, 1 decade after the signing of Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, Astor established his first fur shop, often going into the wilderness himself to guarantee that it remained well stocked. Within a few years, he found his calling in the larger fur and shipping trades, aptly demonstrating an intent to go well beyond the status of a provincial merchant. Astute and pragmatic, the ambitious and at times ruthless Astor owned more than a dozen ships by the turn of the century. Not yet having reached the age of 30, he was already trading in China for tea, opium, and a number of other products not native to the American continent. Astor's imagination concocted and perfected the vision of a multi-directional flow of trade, with products crossing the continent from New York to Oregon, where he had already purchased property by 1806. The fur products would be sent on to several eastern points. Return trips would bring all manner of exotic Asian products to Eastern American and European cities. On the periphery were numerous tribes of the Pacific Northwest, furnishing Astor's company with furs in return for cheaply obtained blankets and beads. Similarly, an additional source of beaver, otter, and other fur-bearing animals was to come from Russian America, present-day Alaska, through Archangelsk, now the city of Sitka. The Russians greatly preferred American business to that of European enterprises and were particularly hopeful that Britain would be pushed out of the region due to political strife between the two countries. In addition to carefully building his companies, Astor watched the competition with a keen eye and learned a great deal from the establishment of the Northwest Company. The personnel of the various fur companies in the New World often kept close company. In the unpopulated wild, they depended on one another as protection against isolation and even collaborated in some circumstances. However, Astor wanted a monopoly on the Pacific Northwest, where all trade with the Indians could be carried out through one company. To accomplish that, he had to accelerate Jefferson's thinking and begin the process quickly before the Northwest Company caught wind of it and intruded. In 1810, through the Pacific Fur Company, Astor began to direct his energies at the still mostly unexploited regions accessible from the mouth of the Columbia River. This was, of course, in open defiance of British claims, but that was very much in keeping with Astor's style. Astor put up the money, and a group of American and Canadian fur traders managed affairs on the ground. While the settlement at Astoria made preparations to explore the interior and set up connecting posts, the international competition increased. By now, American claims were becoming more tangible, especially after Captain Robert Gray's exploration of the Columbia River 30 miles into the interior. Gray, a Bostonian, not only sailed upriver, but established the first American trading relationship with lower Columbia tribes. The Chinook proved to be essential to facilitating the Pacific Fur Company's progress with fellow tribes farther to the interior, although they were never considered entirely reliable. Despite the Pacific Fur Company's success with Concomly and the lower Chinooks, Britain's Northwest Company solidified its hold on the market through the establishment of numerous inland posts, such as the Spokane House, Kootenai House, and Salish House. These were located far up the Columbia, where it turns directly toward the north, hundreds of miles from Astoria. However, it was a region to be exploited, and the Americans immediately affirmed their intention to build there as well. Almost immediately, they responded with a flanking maneuver by soliciting a trade connection with Russian America more rapidly than expected. The effort resulted in a beneficial agreement by which Russia would greatly augment American trading supplies. The agreement was intended to prevent Montreal's presence in the region. Russia's distaste for such a close British presence was a boon for Astor's company's dealings with the far north. From colonial times, the eastern part of the continent was dominated by the Hudson's Bay Company and several French enterprises. Such was Hudson's Bay's scope that, were it to stake a claim in the west, it could dominate the entire coast alongside the Northwest Company. At that point, the British claim to land would take on a stark reality, for an American president intent on connecting the two oceans. The Oregon Country, as it was defined, then comprised an unclaimed region stretching from the 42nd parallel, which was the northern extent of the Spanish claim of California, and the 54th parallel, the southern extremity of the Alaskan Panhandle, above which was Russian territory. Everything in between, comprising modern British Columbia and both Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, was nominally claimed by both Britain and the United States. Neither side, however, had so far staked a formal claim on the territory, so it remained in something of a limbo. It was ungoverned, other than through the nominal authority of the Hudson's Bay Company and an ad hoc system of provisional government devised by the American settlers, who, at that time, were very few in numbers. In the late 1830s, the need for a general administration did not exist, and there was no pressure either in Washington, D.C., or London for this to change. John McLaughlin, in his informal capacity, was one of the very few white men in the territory taking note of the effect of white influence on the native population, and, more importantly, he understood that those effects would only be magnified when large-scale settlement began. This was inevitable, and the natives of the territory had two choices: adapt or die. Meanwhile, the United States was pursuing a policy of manifest destiny. There were very few outside of the extremist fringe who believed that the Americans had any defensible claim to the entire Oregon Territory. In the Willamette Valley and other pockets of land south of the Columbia River, citizens of the United States certainly predominated, but above the line of the Columbia River, although the non-native population remained minimal, it was nonetheless predominantly British. Above the 49th parallel, there were no Americans at all. The focus of the dispute, then, would be the territory to the north and west of the Columbia River, which comprised the modern state of Washington. There were many reasons for the unyielding American position in this regard, but trade and commerce remained the strongest incentives. There was a lack of practical harbors north of San Francisco, which remained for the time being Spanish, and the only region of viable harbors between the 42nd parallel and the 49th parallel was Puget Sound. Thus, in order for the American states to secure an economic position on the Pacific coast and have access to Asian markets, it was essential to secure the possession of this stretch of the coast. The timing was also fortuitous because the British had other problems elsewhere. A series of frontier wars in the colony of New Zealand had broken out, and British political and military resources tended to be focused there. The potato blight took place in Ireland, triggering the Great Famine that would see hundreds of thousands of impoverished Irish come to America. Then, in India, the first of the Sikh Wars erupted, further concentrating British attention east. When missionaries began to arrive in the territory, McLaughlin and more than a few others were confident that they could introduce the natives by degrees to civilization. Two of the area's first missionaries, Marcus Whitman and Henry Spaulding, despised each other and decided in the end to establish separate missions, which was probably the wisest course of action. Gray cast his lot in with Whitman, and the three men returned up the Columbia River with a Hudson's Bay Company guide. Whitman intended to establish his mission among what was known as the Cayuse people, while Spaulding moved further east, settling among the Nez Perce in Lapwai, close to present-day Lewiston, Idaho. Whitman made his way first to the Hudson's Bay Company fort at Walla Walla, site of the modern town of that name, and he based himself there as he began exploring the surrounding countryside for a suitable site. Eventually, he chose a place about 25 miles east of Walla Walla, known as Wai'ialatopu, in open hill country nestled on the banks of the Walla Walla River. The native people in the proximity of Wai'ialatopu were known among whites as the Cayuse, though they referred to themselves as the Wai'iletepuu. Whitman claimed the site for the proposed mission without talking to the Cayuse, and as Narcissa passed the last months of her confinement in Walla Walla, Marcus began clearing ground and erecting the first buildings. The site was located in the foothills of the Blue Mountains of southeastern Washington, and it was as attractive as it was fertile. The river held salmon, the country was wooded, and as far as memory could serve, the Cayuse had used the site to build their lodges. The name, Wai'ialatopu, meant the place of the rye grass, and in many ways it was of significance to the Cayuse. They watched passively as the mission began to take shape, and if they felt any apprehension, it was eased by the gifts they received from Marcus Whitman in the first flush of his enthusiasm. However, as diseases ravaged the nearby natives, tensions rose, and on November 29, 1847, an attack was launched by local Cayuse Indians of the mid-Columbia region against the Wai'ialatopu mission station of Dr. Whitman. The attack was the culmination of years of resentment between the white mission staff and a dwindling band of indigenous people suffering the arbitrary sequestration of their land, waves of disease, and the steady diminution of their numbers. The Whitman Massacre, as it came to be known, set in motion a series of wars and conflicts that would ebb and flare for the next few decades. The Whitman Massacre was just the match that set the spark to the tinder. The underlying causes of the conflict that erupted were about land and natural resources. Manifest destiny, a vague philosophical idea at that time, was a powerful concept for the young United States. In 1823, President James Monroe issued what has been since come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine, which drew a line in the sand over the issue of overseas interference in the Americas. It read in part, "We owe it, therefore, to candor and to the amicable relations existing between the United States and those powers to declare that we should consider any attempt on their part to extend their system to any portion of this hemisphere as dangerous to our peace and safety. With the existing colonies or dependencies of any European power, we have not interfered and shall not interfere. But with the governments who have declared their independence and maintained it, and whose independence we have, on great consideration and on just principles, acknowledged, we could not view any interposition for the purpose of oppressing them, or controlling in any other manner their destiny, by any European power in any other light than as the manifestation of an unfriendly disposition toward the United States." Nevertheless, throughout the early 19th century, a trickle of European settlement took place, involving mainly employees or associates of the Hudson's Bay Company and other smaller commercial interests. In the 1830s, the first American missionaries appeared, sent by the American Board of Commissioners for foreign missions. From wherever missionaries came, settlers were always bound to follow, and that certainly proved to be the case here. By the end of the 1830s, land-hungry pioneers and settlers began making the long journey west in steadily growing numbers, following the Oregon Trail and leaving a cultural and physical imprint across the region as they passed. The pioneers brought plenty of resources with them, but they also brought diseases, and smallpox, measles, tuberculosis, and venereal disease cut through the native populations, claiming an astronomical toll in human lives. Major epidemics swept through the region between 1781 and 1782, and again between 1830 and 1831. The worst affected were the tribes of the Pacific coast, but those along the Columbia River, The Snake River and Great Basin were also affected to varying degrees. Smaller outbreaks of smallpox, influenza, and dysentery were recorded here and there, but the next major epidemic occurred between 1847 and 1848, with an outbreak of measles, which, according to estimates put forward by the Hudson's Bay Company administration, claimed the lives of at least 10% of the entire native population. The Cayuse were defeated in 1855, but by then the wider conflict, the Indian Wars of the Northwest, had spread south into Northern California and across the Cascade Mountains as far east as the Rocky Mountains. These wars would end in defeat for the indigenous natives and mark the close of independent native life in the region. It would also bring about one of the most tragic episodes of the Indian Wars in 1863. Contact with the Shoshone. When a favor is shown to a white man, he feels it in his head, and the tongue speaks out. When a kindness is shown to an Indian, he feels it in his heart, and the heart has no tongue. Shoshone Proverb. The Shoshone, or Shoshone, is a native North American ethnic group originally occupying the Great Basin of the Southwest, with three primary regional divisions today: Northern, Western, and Eastern Shoshone. Many Shoshone were initially referred to as the Snake Indians by early European trappers, travelers, and settlers, though that designation pertained to those particular Shoshone settled along the Snake River in Idaho, not the entire culture. The Shoshone speak the Shoshone language, one of the Numic language branches of the Uto-Aztecan language family, a language family that consists of over 30 known languages found almost exclusively in the western United States and Mexico. The term Uto-Aztecan indicates the conjoining of the Ute language of Utah, the state and language named for the Ute people, and the Aztecan languages of Mexico, which are directly associated with the Aztec people of central Mexico and their primary language, Nahuatl. The Shoshone also have been historically tied to the Bannock, another potential offshoot of the Shoshone. A Uto-Aztecan language-speaking nomadic Great Basin culture that lived in southeastern Idaho and western Wyoming, the Bannock, like the Shoshone, were foragers who lived on plants, roots, insects, and small animals. Among the first of the region to acquire horses, possibly from the Comanche, the Bannock quickly extended their domain into Colorado, Utah, Montana, and Oregon. They also came to resemble the eastern Shoshone after being introduced to the horse, becoming buffalo hunters and adopting Plains Indian cultural habits. As the Numic-speaking Shoshone spread, their lands came to border a number of other indigenous cultures of the region, including the Washoe of California and Nevada, the Northern Paiute of Nevada and southern Oregon, the Utes of central and eastern Utah and parts of western Colorado, the Southern Paiute of southern Nevada, southern Utah, northern Arizona, and southeastern California, the Kauai Sioux of California's Mojave Desert, and Owens Valley Paiute of Owens Valley, California, and a portion of Nevada. The Shoshone also split into three distinct subdivisions: the Northern Shoshone in southern Idaho, a territory shared with the Bannock, Eastern Shoshone, primarily in Wyoming and western Montana, and Western Shoshone, based in eastern California, central and northeastern Nevada, Oregon, and northeastern Utah. According to Shoshone oral history, by the year 1500, the Shoshone had crossed the Rocky Mountains and begun their expansion toward the northwestern plains. By 1700, a group of Shoshone had moved into the southern plains, eventually developing their own identity as the Comanche. After the acquisition of horses from the Spanish, which is believed to have taken place just prior to direct Spanish contact, regional distinctions became sharper, based mainly on primary food sources. The arid domain of the western Shoshone, for example, provided poor grazing for horses, resulting in bands continuing their traditional patterns of foot travel to procure food and promote subsistence behavior. The western Shoshone were often referred to as Shoshoko, meaning walkers or diggers. In contrast, the northern Shoshone, who settled in and around southern Idaho, inhabited land that was much more conducive to horse raising, and subsequently abandoned much of their earlier traditions in favor of adopting Spanish horse culture. The Northern Shoshone acquired herds of horses and used them to hunt the buffalo, bison that grazed west of the Continental Divide. Meanwhile, the Eastern Shoshone of Wyoming capitalized fully on the pastures along the Green River to breed and raise horses, after which they made hunting buffalo their primary endeavor. Coming to be known as buffalo eaters, the Eastern Shoshone would eventually adopt many cultural traits of the Plains tribes, and even their societal structure became virtually indistinguishable from that of other Plains groups. The adoption of the Spanish horse culture shifted the cultural norms and traditions of the Northern and Eastern Shoshone, but it also prompted major lifestyle changes, including among dwelling and clothing. The Northern and Eastern Shoshone originally lived in conical huts made of poles sheathed with grass or reeds, but after they started hunting bison, they began using portable teepees made of hides. Similarly, they abandoned traditional garments, like woven fiber breechcloths for men and front and back aprons for women, in favor of buckskin shirts and leather leggings for men, buckskin dresses over leggings for women, and robes made of buffalo skin in winter. Shoshone men and women wore their hair either loose or in two long braids, which Shoshone men sometimes wrapped in fur, while Shoshone women often wore hats woven of basket material. Shoshone warriors became identifiable by their feathered headdresses, but this did not become the custom until the 19th century, when certain band leaders adopted this habit from their Plains Indian neighbors. Some Shoshone wore facial tattoos and painted their faces for special occasions, such as war, hunting, mourning, rituals, and important gatherings, but this custom was not universal among the Shoshone. In addition to adapting to the general lifestyle associated with buffalo and bison, Northern and Eastern Shoshone also adopted the Plains Indian horse-owning culture. More than just a functional means to an end, horses represented prestige among the Plains groups and were very visible tokens of success and power. The Plateau's Kootenais of Idaho, for example, held great sway among regional tribes due to claiming 3 to 5 horses per tribe member, which made them relatively wealthy. The Nez Perce and Cayuses of Oregon boasted of 5 to 7 horses per man, woman, and child, too. As latecomers to this socio-economic system, the Shoshone had to adopt the understanding that horses equaled prosperity, property, and influence more than anything else. Thus, among the Shoshone, herds were amassed not only by band leaders and chiefs, but even by prominent shaman, midwives, horse racers, and gamblers, all of whom claimed their earnings in ponies. Due to the social status afforded both horse and owner, horses were traded, given as gifts, granted as part of an establishment of alliances and friendships, and offered by prospective sons-in-law to fathers of their intended brides. Since the Great Basin was one of the last areas of the United States to be fully explored and settled by whites, the Shoshone and other Numic-speaking peoples were able to retain their traditional lifestyle and values much longer than most other indigenous groups. But eventually, the arrival of Europeans brought about intercultural and intertribal conflict, and it was the fur trade that had the greatest impact on Shoshone habits and their ability to maintain subsistence practices that had established their regional productivity and power. The coming of Europeans to North America brought great change to the indigenous populations of the Great Basin and western United States even prior to first contact. Even before Spanish Franciscan priests ventured into the basin in the 1770s in search of a route to Alta California to deal in the illegal trade of slaves, indigenous peoples knew of their existence thanks to the horses neighboring groups had acquired. While groups on the plains saw the horse as a means of transportation, in the desert communities of the basin, where vegetation was too sparse to graze horses, they were considered a new source of food. This ensured Europeans influenced the Shoshone long before Spanish explorers appeared on the horizon, and contact was minimal even into the early 1800s, since the basin populations had little the Spanish wanted. Though Spanish trade with Mexico and points south had little direct effect on the Shoshone, that reality changed by 1860, when British and American traders converged on the Great Basin seeking furs and contact with indigenous groups interested in the fur trade. Soon after, basin travel increased as explorers, adventurers, pioneers, and frontiersmen sought their fortune in California, inevitably passing through Shoshone country. But it would not be until the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War, that great change came to the Great Basin, and the change was mostly instigated by the Mormon Church. Beginning in 1847, the Mormons began a steady migration into the basin, bringing a wave of settlers that, despite their attempts to adapt and blend in, caused a tipping of the environmental and human scales. Before long, non-Mormons followed the Mormon Trail, establishing cattle ranches in the basin in and around Shoshone villages. Whites who came into contact with the Shoshone people noted they were currently divided into 4 groups: the Western Shoshone of Nevada and Far West, the Northern Shoshone of Utah and Idaho, the Wind River Shoshone of western Wyoming, and the Comanche of West Texas. This delineation was not necessarily shared by the Shoshone nor other indigenous groups, but the whites who encountered them quickly learned the differences. The Western Shoshone had no band organization, primarily because they were without horses and had no need to organize hunts, so they maintained small family units that were independently nomadic throughout most of the year. Both the Northern and Wind River Shoshone acquired horses soon after arrival of the Spanish, and subsequently formed bands of mounted hunters and warriors like the Plains Indians. And once the Comanche acquired horses, they moved into Texas, where they organized predatory bands that routinely raided Spanish settlements and traded stolen horses to the Shoshone and other indigenous groups of the Southwest and Plains. At the time of first contact, the combined Western and Northern Shoshone are estimated to have been a population of 10,000, with the Wind River Eastern Shoshone at 2,500 and the Comanche at 7,000. Although the Spanish may have had some prior unrecorded contact with the Shoshone, it was the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery expedition of 1804-1806 that made America aware of their existence. Soon after the opening of the West, initiated by the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Shoshone way of life came to a virtual standstill as the various groups sought to understand the changes confronting them. Trappers, traders, and so-called mountain men were suddenly seen crisscrossing their lands with increasing frequency. And on the near horizons came the Mormons in 1847, fortune-seekers during the California gold rush of 1849, and perhaps most detrimental to their traditional way of life, the influx of westbound pioneers after the discovery of the Comstock lode in 1857, a major silver ore vein located under the eastern slope of Mount Davidson in the Virginia range of Nevada-Utah Territory. By this point, outsiders were not just passing through, but erecting permanent settlements in total disregard of Shoshone settlements. By the mid-1840s, it was clear the era of the Palisade Fort, trading post, and itinerant fur trader was over. Thousands of settlers were filling up the Willamette Valley and filtering out into the remote country east of the Cascades. Farms were demarcated, roads were established, and towns and settlements were incorporated. Still, no formal government of any sort yet existed, and neither side seemed in any hurry to change that. Indeed, the attitude of both the British and U.S. governments to the question of Oregon remained at the very least ambivalent. In 1818, and again in 1827, Great Britain and the United States agreed only to joint occupation of the Oregon country, deferring the question of a final division until some time in the future. The Oregon country comprised a region stretching from the present Oregon-California border to 5440, a point just above the 54th parallel, beyond which was Russian territory. From the British point of view, the situation was more acceptable since British subjects were still few in number there and were for the most part subject to the rule of the Hudson's Bay Company. Although imperfect, this arrangement was, at least for the time being, adequate for everyone involved. Law and order in the territory was generally attended to by the company, which was no major burden since the population was minimal. Americans, on the other hand, lay not only outside the jurisdiction of the Hudson's Bay Company, but also beyond the practical reach of the laws of the United States. Congress appeared unconcerned by this, and despite repeated petitions to declare the region a U.S. territory, no steps in that direction were taken. The obvious reason for this was that the territory was jointly claimed, and no arbitrary solution could be imposed without lengthy negotiations with the British authorities. In fact, neither side showed much interest in attending to those negotiations, so things were left as they stood, even as it left the American population of the territory in limbo. The only alternative to American law was British law, and there certainly was no appetite south of the Columbia River for that. The debate within the American community was therefore simply whether to go ahead and form an independent government or to wait indefinitely for Congress to act. It was inevitable that collective decision-making in questions of law would require the formation of a committee or something similar, and that would, in turn, represent a style of government. The first such committee was formed over the question of probate for the intestate estate of a wealthy landowner. To dispose of his property, the assembled committee met on 3 separate occasions, and in effect the committee disposed of a legal process to the satisfaction of all. Settler representatives then met in March 1843 to discuss the question of wildlife attacks on livestock and how to form a common and coordinated response. Funds were collected and accumulated for the hiring of professional hunters, advancing somewhat the new parameters of self-government. The so-called wolf meetings established a basis of rudimentary taxation, along with a system of centralized contracting for a specific, collective social service. A few months later, some 100 American and French-Canadian settlers met at Champoeg, a settlement of the latter. The French-Canadians, incidentally, were part of an early settlement of people employed by the Hudson's Bay Company, augmented over time by French and Belgian immigrants arriving in the area from Europe. They were not happy with either British or American law, although, since they were French, they were more disposed to the latter. In May 1843, by a slim majority, the motion was carried to form a provisional government. Most French speakers dissented, and John McLaughlin for the Hudson's Bay Company, although on cordial terms with all of the signatories and committee members, recorded his refusal to recognize the new government. In general, this decision heightened political tension between the British and Americans in the Pacific Northwest, but on a practical level, everyone involved, even McLaughlin, acknowledged that the process was inevitable and that some fundamental division of the territory was now imminent. Using the resources at their disposal, which at the time comprised a single copy of the organic laws of the state of Iowa, a copy of the U.S. Constitution, and one of the Declaration of Independence, a rudimentary system of laws was devised. These, and a patchwork of established traditions and simple statutes, were combined into a constitution that established the basis and instruments of government. The new constitution provided for a single executive, compulsory taxation, a ban on alcoholic beverages, and the exclusion of blacks from the territory. Whatever the British authorities in the territory might have felt about these events, there was little that they could do. Within the expanding United States, the concept of manifest destiny was fast gaining momentum as an expression of vast confidence and a growing sense of what was possible, as Americans gazed across the vast and empty expanse of the continent with a sense that it was theirs. In the face of that, British mercantile interests above the Columbia River presented a weak bulwark. The eventual annexation of Texas and the occupation of Oregon were the battle cries of this movement, and to them, taking Oregon implied the entirety of the territory from the border of California to the mythical 5440. In fact, American expansionists took up a much more belligerent battle cry, proclaiming 5440 or fight. Nonetheless, opinion was divided in Congress. While the popular mood throughout the country was bullish and aggressive, within Congress there were those who did not necessarily acknowledge the value of the territory, other than perhaps as a penal colony. Occasional meetings of British and American plenipotentiaries were held over the matter, but neither side seemed interested in pursuing the matter further than that. It was not until the inauguration of President James K. Polk in March 1845 that the matter was elevated higher up the list of government priorities. In his inaugural speech, Polk remarked that the American claim to Oregon was clear and unquestionable. After that, it was Polk who took the matter up, proposing to the British that the territory be divided along the 49th parallel. When the British declined, Polk took a more assertive position, declaring that American honor and interests were at stake, and that he was unprepared to compromise. There were very few outside of the extremist fringe who believed that the United States had any defensible claim to the entire Oregon country. In the Willamette Valley and other pockets of land south of the Columbia River, citizens of the United States certainly predominated, but above the line of the Columbia River, although the non-native population remained minimal, it was nonetheless predominantly British. Above the 49th parallel, there were no Americans at all. The focus of the dispute, then, was the territory to the north and west of the Columbia River, which comprised the modern state of Washington. There were many reasons for the unyielding American position in this regard, but trade and commerce remained the strongest incentives. There was a lack of practical harbors north of San Francisco, which remained for the time being Spanish, and the only region of viable harbors between the 42nd and 49th parallels was Puget Sound. Thus, in order for the United States to secure an economic position on the Pacific coast and have access to Asian markets, it was essential to secure the possession of this stretch of the coast. The timing was also fortuitous because the British had other problems elsewhere. A series of frontier wars in the colony of New Zealand had broken out, and British political and military resources tended to be focused there. The potato blight took place in Ireland, triggering the Great Famine that would see hundreds of thousands of impoverished Irish come to America. Then, in India, the first of the Sikh Wars erupted, further concentrating British attention east. It was in 1846, too, that President Polk announced the Monroe Doctrine was to be rigidly enforced, and that the United States should aggressively move west. Nonetheless, the political system did not always respond with the same enthusiasm as some of its leaders. Congressional debate on the matter dragged on until the spring of 1846, when the United States once again invited Great Britain to the negotiating table. In May of that year, Polk completed the annexation of Texas, regarded often as the first overt act of American imperialism, which, if nothing else, confirmed that this time Congress was serious. In April, the Mexican-American War began, and it would end in the 1848 annexation of California. America was on the march, and manifest destiny was manifest indeed. By then, the Hudson's Bay Company had moved its operational headquarters to Victoria Island in the future British Columbia, and the Columbia region was of less direct importance to its operations. Besides that, the British were still preoccupied with fighting in India, uprisings in New Zealand, starving Irishmen, and a political crisis at home, the latter of which would see conservative Prime Minister Robert Peel yield power to the Whig Lord John Russell. Put simply, the business of a boundary in the remote Pacific Northwest was not of particular interest, and, to Polk's surprise, an agreement was relatively easily reached. The 49th parallel was accepted as the new international boundary, with a slight manipulation in the area of Vancouver Island to ensure that it was British territory. There was some grumbling about this in Washington, but it was accepted as inevitable. The Hudson's Bay Company retained the right to freely navigate the Columbia River south of the 49th parallel until 1860. The treaty was ratified by the Senate in June 1846, but for a while after that, a rather poorly defined water boundary south of Vancouver Island caused some jostling and acrimony, which was brought to a head by the curious episode of the Pig War of 1859. The events of this minor scuffle are, if nothing else, a reminder of how easily wars can be started. The area contested was the San Juan Islands, a small archipelago clustered at the southeastern heel of Vancouver Island. The islands were claimed by both sides, and a Cold War of sorts existed, with neither side willing to back down. One day, a British-owned pig strayed onto an American-owned potato patch and was killed, triggering a dispute between citizens on both sides. It was then backed up by a military display and some posturing on both sides that stopped just short of shots being fired. It was agreed that the islands would remain under joint military administration until 1872, when the dispute was arbitrated in favor of the United States by Kaiser Wilhelm I, the newly coronated Emperor of Germany. The British were heard to complain in the aftermath that no German monarch was likely ever to rule in favor of Great Britain, but nonetheless the San Juan Islands passed to the United States, and that seemed to be the end of the matter. Of course, as more and more white settlers migrated west, tensions increased among the indigenous population as it quickly became clear that the natives would be granted few concessions. In response to flagrant disregard of native hunting and habitation patterns, Great Basin groups began raiding wagon trains and stagecoaches traveling along the central overland route to California, which cut directly through sacred Shoshone lands. To discourage further intrusion and emphasize the isolation of the region, They intercepted Pony Express riders and attacked telegraph line stringers. The Northern Shoshone, under Chief Pocatello, 1815 to 1884, began raiding white farms and ranches for food and horses, often killing settlers in the process. In 1860, a minor gold rush was sparked in the region of the Clearwater River of central Idaho, when gold was discovered on Nez Perce land by Elias Davidson Pierce, a native of Harris County, West Virginia. Pierce City was established, and within a year it numbered 4,000 residents. By the summer of 1863, some 35,000 whites were settled in the interior regions. The isolated frontier settlement of Walla Walla emerged as a significant link in the supply chain of goods and equipment into the interior, and for a while there were fears in Olympia that it might take over as the administrative capital of the territory. The subsequent discovery of gold in Montana added a further complication to the conundrum of controlling and governing an ever-expanding territory. There was very little regret felt in Olympia, therefore, when on March 4, 1863, Congress made the decision to combine Washington's far-flung mining regions into a new territory called Idaho. The former governor of the Washington Territory, William H. Wallace, was appointed by President Abraham Lincoln as the first territorial governor of Idaho. Of course, even as American politicians were trying to sort out the political issues and boundaries, there were still plenty of natives living on the land being claimed. In 1861, the Washington legislature passed an ordinance forbidding marriage between whites and Indians, criminalizing a practice that had been ongoing for decades. The interracial nature of the early days of mercantile settlements were generally the days of peace and harmony, but after the Whitman Massacre, nothing was ever the same again. The decade before it had never been free of violence, but Indians were so integral to the fur trade that usually petty differences were settled in one way or another to the satisfaction of both sides. The years of the fur trade were not years of mass European settlement, and certainly not years of mass land appropriation. The dispossession of the native people of the region was a result of America's push west, and the Whitman Massacre coincided with that transition and the efforts of indigenous people to resist the monumental changes that white settlement caused, few of which were to their advantage. A contributing factor, of course, was the fundamental failure of each side to appreciate or understand the other, a phenomenon repeated in India, Africa, and other places that imperialistic powers came into contact with older, indigenous populations. The beginning of the end. On the battlefield, the troops counted 224 bodies, including that of Bear Hunter, and knew that the toll was actually higher. They destroyed 70 lodges and quantities of provisions, seized 175 Indian horses, and captured 160 women and children, who were left in the wrecked village with a store of food. Robert M. Utley. On August 20, 1852, a wagon train of 20 settlers, led by Alexander Ward, was attacked by a war party of Shoshone as it was headed to Fort Boise, killing all but 2 children in a gratuitously brutal manner. The Ward massacre has since entered Western lore for the cruelty displayed during the attack, and it further confirmed popular belief in the incorrigible barbarity of the native races. The massacre began during an early afternoon stop on the south bank of the Boise River after a Shoshone was shot dead during a coordinated attempt to steal horses. The Ward party was ambushed soon afterwards, and in a sustained attack, the men were all killed, the women were sexually tortured, and most of the children were burned to death on an open fire. 2 young brothers were shot down, but they survived and were eventually able to make their way to Fort Boise and safety. 3 of the raiding party were later captured and tried. 2 were hanged, and the 3rd was shot trying to escape. The U.S. Army pursued the remainder of the war party, and for some time insecurity was so severe in the district that both Fort Hall and Fort Boise were abandoned, while the Oregon Trail and California Trail effectively closed in the area. Following the Platte River, a tributary of the Missouri River, was the Mormon Trail, another migration route that carried Mormons from Illinois to their fabled valley in the Utah desert. The movement was led by the Mormon leader Brigham Young, and before long Mormons began probing north into the territory of southern Idaho, adding to the difficulties of race relations. Brigham Young's orders were for Mormon immigrants to endeavor at all times to cultivate friendly relations with the natives and to engage in no hostilities. Nonetheless, Mormon immigrants only added to the pressures of land and resources, settling the Cache Valley, along with other white Americans, in numbers that began to push out the nomadic Shoshone into areas of increasingly marginal viability. Discussion of an Indian reservation in the Cache Valley went on for some time, but nothing ever came of it, and it was inevitable that bands of Shoshone would begin to be driven out of their traditional ranges. Their scope of migration was inhibited, and the herds of big game that they traditionally depended on were decimated. It was inevitable, therefore, that they would begin to raid settled homesteads and ranches for food, simply as a matter of survival. The situation was the responsibility of local state and territorial Indian administration, Oregon and Idaho. But in the spring of 1862, it was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for Utah Territory, James Duane Doty, who traveled to the Cache Valley to survey the situation himself and submit a report. When he arrived, he was shocked at what he discovered. The Indians have been in great numbers in a starving and destitute condition, no provisions having been made for them either as to clothing or provisions by my predecessors. The Indians' condition was such, with the prospect that they would rob mail stations to sustain life. In 1861, the Civil War began, and President Lincoln was concerned that California, included in the United States only in 1850, might become isolated from the rest of the Union by hostile Native American activity. He also did not entirely trust the loyalty of the Mormons in Utah, which was administered as a U.S. territory, but with a population answerable first to Brigham Young. Mormon authorities swore loyalty to the Union, but Lincoln was not prepared to take any chances. So the U.S. War Department was ordered to raise several volunteer regiments from the population of California to assist in protecting lines of communication east. Among the first to be raised was the Third California Infantry Regiment, organized between October 31st and December 31st, 1861, to serve for a period of 3 years. The regiment was placed under the command of Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, and in July 1862 it was dispatched to the District of Utah, where it remained for the 3 years of its service. Colonel Connor's orders were to protect the overland mail routes and maintain the peace, the latter a guarded euphemism for keeping an eye on the Mormons. At the same time, the struggle west of the Mississippi River between the embattled indigenous groups and the rapidly expanding populations of settlers was well underway, even as Americans were preoccupied with the Civil War. The Indian Wars would climax in the years after the Civil War, and most of the defining episodes would take place then, but the early acts of the drama were already beginning to play out. Colonel Connor was a typical product of the United States military establishment of the time. He was a 42-year-old Irishman from County Kerry who, as Patrick O'Connor, immigrated to the United States in 1839 and enlisted immediately in the U.S. Army. He took part in the Seminole Wars and the Mexican-American War before heading west to California to join the gold rush. Clearly, he did not strike it rich, for within months of his arrival he was back in uniform. In the 1850s, he saw service with the California State Rangers before his appointment as colonel and officer commanding the Third California Infantry Regiment. Besides these essential military credentials, Colonel Connor also had an aggressive nature that was probably the best qualification for military service on the frontier. He was scornful of regulations, aloof of military hierarchy, and something of a maverick. As a Roman Catholic, he was instinctively inimical toward the Mormons, who were polygamous, non-Christian in his opinion, and loyal to Brigham Young, who Connor regarded as a tyrant flagrantly disregarding federal authority. During most of his service in Utah, he engaged in a war of words with the Mormon authorities, drawing the ire of Brigham Young, who accused him, quite justly, of encouraging Gentiles to settle Utah. On arrival, he established a fort, later called Fort Douglas, and which today is in the metropolitan precincts of Salt Lake City. There he established his headquarters, busying his men with their garrison duties, while pursuing a policy of antagonizing the Mormons whenever an opportunity presented itself. While the Civil War was being fought, various conflicts in the Pacific Northwest were taking place, and in Arizona, war broke out with the Apache. There were also conflicts with the Arapaho and Cheyenne in Colorado, culminating in the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864. Numerous separate conflicts and campaigns were underway on the Great Plains, which would continue in various corners of the region until the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890. The common cause of each one was white expansion, and the same was true in the Great Basin. The Civil War ensured that there was minimal administration along the frontier, which helped make it possible for a confrontation to take place in an ill-defined region overlapping the borders of Utah and Washington before the establishment of the Idaho Territory in 1863. As a result, the administrative centers responsible for dealing with Indian matters sat over 1,000 miles distant from one another, and some distance from the area of conflict. Given the distances, governance was typically handled by nearby settlers and ad hoc local committees. Brigham Young's feed them rather than fight them policy was perfectly sound, but it rarely translated to the frontier, and conflict on a minor, localized level was a fact of life. By the 1860s, the Northern Shoshone were dealing with the combined effects of pioneers moving west on the Oregon Trail, miners moving north into Montana and passing directly through the Cache Valley, and Mormon settlers pushing progressively north. No definitive policy was in place to deal with this, and under increasingly desperate circumstances, the Shoshone were displaying more aggression and violence. Inevitably, settlers were responding in kind. One particular incident that is often cited as an early spur to official U.S. military involvement was the execution of Pughweenie. When a settler in the area of Summit Creek in modern Cache County, Utah, noticed a horse missing, he accused a local Shoshone youth fishing in a nearby creek of stealing it. The boy was examined and convicted by a local jury and promptly hanged. The boy gave his name as Pughweenie, which translates as fish, suggesting that he responded to the accusation with the explanation that he was simply fishing. This type of arbitrary action very much characterized the state of relations between the two sides at the time, and such things happened with depressing regularity. In this case, however, the boy was the son of a local Shoshone chief, who responded within a few days by attacking and killing two white kids gathering firewood in the same vicinity. Not long afterwards, in the summer of 1859, a party of 19 settlers moving west along the Oregon Trail near Fort Hall were set upon at night by a group of attackers that they assumed were local Shoshone. A few whites were killed in the incident, and the local army detachment at Fort Walla Walla in Oregon was sent to investigate. But nothing was done other than to note the incident and decry its treachery and brutality. In September 1860, a larger group of immigrants moving west along the Oregon Trail, led by Elijah Utter, was almost entirely wiped out and had its livestock stolen by Bannock Shoshone of the Boise. 6 children of the Van Ornum family were taken hostage, and the incident was investigated by a company of U.S. Army, but again no direct action was taken. News eventually reached relatives of the Van Ornum family that a white boy whose description corresponded to one of the abducted children was alive and living with a group of Northwestern Shoshone, probably somewhere in the Cache Valley. When they learned about the white boy, Colonel Connor received a visit from a small delegation of family and friends of the Van Ornum family. They submitted a request for help in locating and freeing the boy. At that point, the Californians of the 3rd Infantry Regiment were bristling under the restrictions of garrison duty while the war was building in the east. A petition was drawn up and sent to the U.S. Department of War requesting a $35,000 deduction from their wages to finance transport east to the states where the fighting was taking place. The request was to serve their country in shooting traitors instead of eating rations and freezing to death around sagebrush fires. The request was turned down by the War Department, but it was clear that the California men were spoiling for a fight, and if they could not take on the Confederates, then the Indians would do. Colonel Connor agreed to help, and a detachment of cavalry was sent to the Cache Valley under the command of Major Edward McGarry. The two groups met up near Providence, Utah, a few miles from Logan, and on the east side of the Cache Valley. From there, a reconnaissance located a small group of Shoshone led by Chief Bear Hunter. The combined force of Major McGarry's cavalry detachment and the Van Ornum party picked up their trail and began a pursuit. The Indians retreated into Providence Canyon, about a mile southwest of Providence, and from where sporadic sniping began. Major McGary's orders were simply to shoot and kill every Indian who came into sight, and he was of the inclination to do just that. A brisk skirmish followed that lasted about 3 hours before Bear Hunter signaled surrender with a flag of truce. Bear Hunter and about 20 of his people were taken into custody and effectively held hostage against the return of the white boy, who, it turned out, had been taken out of the area just a few days earlier. By noon the following day, a party of Shoshone returned to Providence with the boy, who was identified as Reuben Van Ornum, and returned with his family to Oregon. The Shoshone, however, insisted that the boy was the child of a French fur trapper and a Shoshone woman. Despite their protests, the matter was concluded, and the official report, dated November 28, 1862, stated, "I left Cache Valley on the morning of the 27th, without loss or scratch of man or horse. It affords me great pleasure to report to the Colonel, commanding, the good conduct of the command, and during the fight, which lasted about 2 hours, the officers and men behaved handsomely." The Bear River Massacre. With ordinary good luck, the volunteers will wipe them out. We wish this community rid of all such parties, and if Colonel Connor be successful in reaching that bastard class of humans who play with the lives of the peaceable and law-abiding citizens in this way, we shall be pleased to acknowledge our obligations. The Deseret News. After getting back the boy, Colonel Connor was able to reflect on his first successful operation, and at least a few of his men had fired shots in anger. From Camp Douglas on December 2, 1862, he reported to the Assistant Adjutant of the Department of the Pacific that the boy was correctly identified as Reuben Van Ornum, and that the 3 sisters abducted alongside him were dead. The boy, interestingly, had blond hair, and although he could speak little to no English and could say little about his own background, it seems unlikely that he was a child of a Native American woman and a French trapper. The Shoshone, however, continued to claim that the child was one of their own, and they sought compensation from the settlers of the Cache Valley, who offered up 2 cows and some flour for the sake of keeping the peace. Colonel Connor's report also expressed concern that the natives were threatening the overland mail route to the east of Fort Douglas, but he claimed no such difficulties were experienced to the west, as the lessons I have been teaching them and the messages I send them make them fear me. A few days later, McGary was back in the field, this time to recover stolen livestock in the Cache Valley. 4 Shoshone were apprehended and held hostage against the return of the livestock, and when no livestock were returned, the 4 hostages were executed by firing squad and dumped in the Bear River. The Shoshone chiefs moved their bands further north in the Cache Valley, and in revenge, 2 freight haulers were killed and mutilated on the Montana Trail. These violent events clearly seemed to be building up to something bigger. The Montana Trail, the only link between the scattered and isolated mining camps of Montana, was effectively closed, and both Mormon and Gentile settlers were complaining about the increasing insecurity in the Cache Valley and the frontier. From his headquarters at Fort Douglas, Colonel Connor began giving thought to some sort of definitive action that would deal with the rebel Shoshone once and for all. Furthermore, he was still under pressure from his companies. The soldiers were spoiling for a fight, and a growing number of men were deserting to make their way east and join the Civil War. What finally convinced Colonel Connor the moment had arrived was a Shoshone attack that occurred in early January 1863, involving 8 miners moving up the Montana Trail. Within a few miles of the main Shoshone winter camp north of Franklin, about 20 miles north of Logan, the party found themselves lost, and while some waited, others returned to Richmond for help. In the meanwhile, 5 of the men who remained behind were attacked by the Shoshone, and a running battle followed, during which John Henry Smith of Walla Walla, Oregon, was killed. The survivors made their way back to Salt Lake City, where testimony was given before Chief Justice John F. Kinney. The supporting affidavit detailed the killing of John Henry Smith, adding that 10 miners had been murdered in the same vicinity just a few days earlier. Though that was unconfirmed, it was nonetheless taken into account. An arrest warrant was issued for Chiefs Bear Hunter, Sandpitch, and Sagwitch, and Colonel Connor's assistance was officially requested by the territorial marshal to bring in the guilty parties. Days before undertaking the operation, Colonel Connor forwarded a dispatch to the Department of the Pacific that told authorities, "I have the honor to report to you that from information received from various sources of the encampment of a large body of Indians on the Bear River, 140 miles, 230 kilometers, north of this point, who had murdered several miners during the winter, passing to and from the settlements in this valley to the Bear River mines east of the Rocky Mountains. And being satisfied that they were part of the same band who had been murdering immigrants on the overland mail route for the last 15 years, and the principal actors and leaders in the horrid massacre of the past summer, I determined, although the season was unfavorable to military expedition in consequence of cold weather and deep snow, to chastise them, if possible." For most of January, Colonel Connor and his staff had labored to prepare an expeditionary force, as he put it, to deal conclusively with the Northern Shoshone in a single and decisive operation. His strategy was to dispatch a small infantry force into the Cache Valley in advance of his main expeditionary force, judging, and rightly, that they would not fear a small number. Connor intended then to follow himself, a few days later, with a much larger force numbering some 220 men, supported by light artillery and comprising mainly cavalry. On January 22nd, the preliminary infantry advance under the command of Captain Samuel W. Hoyt departed Fort Douglas and began its march north toward the Cache Valley. The weather was inclement, and temperatures were bitterly cold. The detachment was supported by 15 wagons and 2 light artillery pieces. It was a small but potent force, and Connor was correct insofar as it did not unduly disturb the Shoshone. As Major McGarry had already discovered, a light and mobile Shoshone force was able to scatter ahead of any concentrated advance, and for the time being, an encumbered infantry detachment seemingly posed no serious threat. To add to the deception, the infantry marched by day while the cavalry moved at night. A general order was in effect for any upcoming battle that no prisoners would be taken. The preliminary infantry advance was noticed by a small part of the Shoshone on January 28th, when the column arrived in Franklin, a settlement now located just north of the border between Utah and Idaho. 3 Shoshone were in town attempting to acquire supplies in anticipation that some army action was pending, and when the column of soldiers appeared on the outskirts of town, they wasted no time in leaping on their horses and fleeing the settlement in haste. This scuttled Connor's hopes of a surprise attack, but nonetheless the 2 columns met up in Franklin, where Connor met with Hoyt and established a plan to move out in the early hours of the following morning to make the best of the element of surprise. This could not have come as welcome news to many of the soldiers who were dealing with temperatures well below freezing. Despite their original fervor and their enthusiasm for battle, about a third of the attacking force were put out of action by frostbite and various other real or imagined conditions. Colonel Connor subsequently explained in his report on the operation, "I ordered Captain Hoyt, with the infantry, howitzers, and train, to move at 1 o'clock the next morning, intending to start with the cavalry about 2 hours thereafter, in order to reach the Indian encampment at the same time and surround it before daylight. But in consequence of the difficulty in procuring a guide to ford the river, Captain Hoyt did not move until after 3 a.m. This, it might be added, left a company of infantry standing around for 2 hours in bitterly cold conditions, growing more dispirited and irritated by the minute. Nonetheless, as Colonel Connor put it, I moved the cavalry in about an hour afterwards, passing the infantry, artillery, and wagons about 4 miles from the Indian encampment. As daylight was approaching, I was apprehensive that the Indians would discover the strength of my force and make their escape. I therefore made a rapid march with the cavalry and reached the bank of the Bear River shortly after daylight in full view of the Indian encampment. I immediately ordered Major McGarry to advance with the cavalry and surround before attacking them, while I remained a few minutes in the rear to give orders to the infantry and artillery. On my arrival on the field, I found that Major McGarry had dismounted the cavalry and was engaged with the Indians, who had sallied out of their hiding places on foot and horseback, and, with fiendish malignity, waved the scalps of white women and challenged the troops to battle, at the same time attacking them. The Shoshone were not taken by surprise and were ready and willing to engage. Central to the Native American war strategy, in particular among those reliant on horses, was mobility, so the accumulation of supplies was probably their fundamental concern, hence the presence in Franklin of 3 Shoshone attempting to do just that. By this time, the Shoshone were armed with firearms, but these were not of standard issue, and most used black powder. They were not in any way comparable to the modern and standardized rifles used by the U.S. Army. The Shoshone also used arrows, knives, and axes, which all meant they would be significantly outgunned. Some defensive preparations had been undertaken in the form of willow branches woven into screens and barricades to hide shooting positions, and an effort was clearly made to choose a reasonably defensive position. The encampment was positioned on the north bank of the Bear River in the lee of the smaller Beaver Creek, now known as Battle Creek, offering protection on 3 sides, and a series of rifle pits were dug. As it turned out, these preparations would all prove to be of very limited utility. As the confrontation was about to take place, a delegation of Shoshone, led by Chief Sandpitch, was in Salt Lake City attempting to negotiate peace. As such, it's possible the Shoshone who were about to encounter Connor and his soldiers may have assumed the Americans would not be as hostile as they ended up being. Sandpitch, however, did not find the whites interested in peace. Brigham Young took the view that the Shoshone had simply run amok one too many times and caused far too much damage for the traditional Mormon forbearance to apply. If it was time for some Shoshone to learn a lesson, and if the Californians were in the valley and ready to fight, the Mormons might take the opportunity to contribute. On the morning of January 29, 1863, any hope of a peaceful settlement was shattered, as the silence of a bitterly cold dawn was torn by the sounds of rifle fire and the frantic movement of Shoshone as they darted out of their camp and made for their horses. Colonel Connor's assessment of his enemy bearing down intimidatingly, waving the scalps of innocent white women killed in the months and years prior, seems obviously overdramatic in light of the facts, but it's clear both sides knew they had a fight on their hands. Connor wrote, "Finding it impossible to surround them, in consequence of the nature of the ground, he, Major McGarry, accepted their challenge. The position that the Indians were in was one of strong defenses, and almost inaccessible to the troops, being in a deep, dry ravine from 6 to 12 feet deep and from 30 to 40 feet wide, with very abrupt banks and running across tableland, along which they had constructed steps from which they could deliver fire without themselves being exposed. Under the embankments they had constructed artificial covers of willows thickly woven together, from behind which they could fire without being observed. This opening skirmish went on for about 20 minutes before Connor realized that his force would suffer considerable loss of life trying to dislodge the prepared defenses. At the same time, Captain Hoyt's infantry was stopped in its tracks by the river, and while some efforts were made to cross it, a combination of bitterly cold water and a fast-moving current turned the detachment back. Horses were ordered back to assist, and the infantry was pushed forward. In combination with McGarry's cavalry, the infantry mounted a flanking maneuver which proved more successful than a frontal assault. Up to that point, the Shoshone had held the advantage, claiming quite a number of casualties, but with a flanking party now in the ravine, the situation changed as the American soldiers entered the mountains. The Californians began to advance down the ravine and pour enfilading fire into the Shoshone flank, which soon broke. As Shoshone fighters broke cover, they encountered a volunteer company stationed at the mouth of the ravine, and these soldiers began picking off natives with accurate, concentrated rifle fire. As Connor later remarked, a few kept up the fight with courage and obstinacy, but the battle was decided. Cavalry was ordered in, and more natives were killed. The colonel reported, "The most of those who did escape from the ravine were afterwards shot in attempting to swim the river, or killed while desperately fighting under cover of the dense willow thicket which lined the river bank." At this point, the battle was over, but the massacre was just starting. The fighting had commenced around 6 a.m., and by 8 a.m. the Shoshone had mostly run out of ammunition, with some reports of Shoshone defenders attempting to cast lead bullets in the heat of battle and dying with moles still in their hands. Once the ammunition was depleted, and once they realized that they would not be allowed to surrender, the surviving Shoshone began using traditional weapons, and more than a handful of soldiers were killed by tomahawks and arrows. As the actual battle was winding down, Connor completely lost control of his men, but he likely didn't care about the coming reprisals anyway. Army detachments began to indiscriminately slaughter men, women, and children, and some soldiers began to rape victims. Those who resisted were killed, and many who submitted were also killed. Infants were lifted by their feet and had their brains beaten out on any hard substance they could find. The Shoshone encampment was torched, with dwellings set on fire, regardless of whether they were empty or occupied. The wounded were dispatched with axes, resulting in the murder of more women and children. Many of the precise details of the massacre came from anecdotal reports made by some of the soldiers present, and by civilians who afterwards scoured the field to establish exactly what took place. It's possible some of the reports were exaggerated, but the casualty figures offer some insight into how the final hour played out. The U.S. Army recorded 21 killed and 46 wounded, while the Shoshone lost an estimated 246 killed, including Chief Bear Hunter, and 164 wounded or captured. 90 of the killed were women and children. According to the 1911 memoir of a Danish immigrant by the name of Hans Jaspersen, who soon afterwards visited the site, he counted 493 dead. Chief Sagwich's son, Bishop Timbimbo, who was a child at the time and who was shot 7 times, reported in 1918 that 156 were killed, while half of the population of the encampment escaped. Many others died later, while a handful of survivors ended up in the Fort Hall Reservation in the Wind River country. Whatever the actual numbers were, the Bear River Massacre was one of the most egregious massacres of the Indian Wars, and while the degree of brutality varies depending on whose account is telling the story, even the most charitable accounts paint a picture of soldiers running amok. Of course, Colonel Connor portrayed all of this in a rather different light, and he spun the imbalanced casualty figures as a success. He reported, "I take great pleasure in awarding to Major McGarry, 2nd Cavalry California Volunteers, Major Gallagher, and Surgeon R.K. Reed, 3rd Infantry California Volunteers, the highest praise for their skill, gallantry, and bravery throughout the engagement, and to the company officers the highest praise is due without invidious distinction for their bravery, courage, and determination evidenced throughout the engagement." From a purely military standpoint, the operation was quite obviously a success. The Shoshone were in an excellent defensive position, the temperature was terribly cold, and the 3rd California Infantry Regiment was operating at the end of an extended march from Salt Lake City. The artillery could not be brought up to the front because of heavy snow, so it was not used. Had the Shoshone been better supplied or better led, then the outcome of the battle might have been very different. Perhaps the deciding factor was the fact that the defending Shoshone ran out of ammunition, which rendered their defense tenable only in hand-to-hand combat. At the moment the Shoshone put aside their firearms and took up their other weapons, the battle was lost. Chief Bear Hunter was killed, but Chief Sagwich, despite being hit twice, survived. Those who lived did so by taking refuge in the riparian willow brush that fringed the Bear River. Given the nature of the massacre, it was inevitable that the soldiers did some mopping up, and once they concluded that the battle was over, they gathered up their dead and wounded and left the battlefield. The townspeople of Franklin welcomed them back, and although the news was sobering, the result was mostly celebrated. A few locals, namely missionaries and churchmen, made their way to the battlefield to provide what assistance they could to the dying and the survivors, but for the most part the defeated Shoshone were left in the freezing conditions to regroup as best they could. Quite a number of those who did offer assistance were Mormons, who perhaps felt some common cause with the Shoshone in their mutual dislike of the forces and agents of the federal government. Colonel Connor made this specific point in his report that the Mormons provided no assistance whatsoever to his army. There is some significance to this because a large part of the presence of the 3rd California Volunteer Infantry Regiment in Utah was to keep the Mormons under observation and ensure that no pro-Confederacy action of any sort took place. Colonel Connor further added that most of the goods found to be in the possession of the Shoshone had been supplied by the Mormons. Colonel Connor's concluding comment told authorities, "The chiefs Pocatello and Sandpitch, with their bands of murderers, are still at large. I hope to be able to kill or capture them before spring. If I succeed, the overland route west of the Rocky Mountains will be rid of the Bedouins who have harassed and murdered immigrants on that route for a series of years. In consequence of the numbers of men left on the route with frozen feet and those with the train and the howitzers and guarding the cavalry horses, I did not have to exceed 200 men engaged. The enemy had about 300 warriors, mostly well armed with rifles and having plenty of ammunition. which rumor says they received from the inhabitants of the territory in exchange for the property of massacred immigrants. The position of the Indians was one of great natural strength, and had I not succeeded in flanking them, the mortality in my command would have been terrible. In consequence of the deep snow, the howitzers did not reach the field in time to be used in the action. With Chief Bear Hunter dead, the leadership of the group fell to Chief Sagwitch, who survived 2 injuries and his horse shot out from underneath him. As the story goes, he crawled into the Bear River and floated in the freezing water under willow brush until nightfall. He then gathered together the survivors and built fires to keep them warm. Nonetheless, the fighting at Bear River marked the end of Shoshone influence in the Cache Valley, which was subsequently opened for Mormon settlement and formed a staging point for a more concentrated immigration drive into southern Idaho. Having lost thousands to war, most of them now resigned themselves to peaceful coexistence on one of the federally established reservations. But reservation life proved demeaning, and more than many Shoshone were willing to endure. Some of them also continued to fight with the Bannock. Known to frequently ally with the Northern Shoshone, in 1869 the U.S. seized an opportunity to pacify both groups by establishing Fort Hall Reservation in southeastern Idaho, with promises of no more white incursion into their lands. The reservation was established by the Fort Bridger Treaty of 1868 between the federal government and the Shoshone and Bannock tribes in the aftermath of the Bear River Massacre. But food supplies were less than adequate on the reservation, forcing the Bannock to leave in search of traditional foodstuffs, particularly camas plants that grew near Fort Boise in southwest Idaho. When white pig farmers allowed their stock to destroy indigenous camas patches and disputed the Bannock's right to forage, the Bannock and Northern Paiute revolted, setting off the Bannock War in 1878. The conflict ended when the Bannock involved were captured that September, but by then the Northern Shoshone had enlisted the Bannock to help fight what would become known as the Sheep Eater War, an effort to defend their Salmon River mountain sheep supply from whites. In the summer of 1878, white settlers had accused a band of Shoshone of stealing horses in Indian Valley, Idaho, killing 3 settlers and ambushing 2 prospectors at Pearsall Creek, 5 miles from Cascade. Then, in February 1879, others were accused of killing 5 Chinese miners at Oro Grande and several murders at Loon Creek, and finally in May of killing 2 ranchers at the South Fork of the Salmon River. Although the evidence linking the Shoshone to these killings was nothing more than hearsay, the U.S. Army dispatched troops to bring the unnamed insurgents to justice. There were a few minor skirmishes, but by October, Army Lieutenants W.C. Brown and Edward S. Farrow were able to negotiate a surrender that ended hostilities with the sheep-eaters. Elsewhere, the Indian Wars continued, and in the Pacific Northwest, the most famous conflict was the Nez Perce War of 1877. Shrinking reservations and white encroachments caused non-treaty groups to occupy land outside the group's reservation. This was indulged by local and federal authorities until the land began to fill up with whites, and the Nez Perce were inevitably pressured to return to the reservations. 4 settlers were killed by a rogue group of young Nez Perce, and war followed soon afterwards. During mid-1877, 800 Nez Perce men, women, and children, along with a herd of more than 2,000 horses, took flight across the Bitterroot Mountains, where they hoped to find sanctuary among the Crow, or, alternatively, to find asylum in Canada. They were pursued by a detachment of the U.S. Army led by the one-armed Colonel Oliver Otis Howard. On August 9th and 10th, the defining battle of the Big Hole was fought, ending inevitably in a defeat for the Nez Perce band. The flight continued, however, growing ever more desperate with each mile. The refugees crossed the Montana Territory through the Yellowstone National Park, continuing on to the 49th parallel. Just 40 miles south of that goal, they were intercepted. After a 1,700-mile exodus, only 480 Nez Perce were present to surrender. The captives were exiled to Oklahoma and permitted to return to the Northwest only in 1885. By then, most natives were settled on reservations. Ostensibly, it had been achieved by treaties and negotiations, but in reality it was a combination of diseases, exhaustion, diminishing numbers, and the pressure of white expansion that solved the land disputes in the area and allowed for permanent boundaries to be established in the Pacific Northwest. The legacy of the Bear River Massacre. Events that transpired over time had only one conclusion. But as I have gotten older, I have come to realize that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day I read a quote attributed to Winston Churchill, and he said, "History is always written by the victors." That explains perfectly why my people's perspectives were never written. Darren Perry, Northwestern Shoshone Chairman. After the massacre, Connor and his men returned to Salt Lake City as minor heroes, and the men of the California Volunteers were able to claim battle honors in the Civil War. In recognition of the military achievement, Connor was promoted to brigadier general. At the end of the war, the Volunteers were demobilized and regular units of the U.S. Army took over Fort Douglas. The old palisade fort was replaced by a stone-built construction, chapel, and administrative buildings that soon became the preferred deployment for men on service in the Frontier Army. Patrick Connor remained in Utah after the war, but his influence was muted when his military career came to an end in 1866. He settled into business, never achieving a great deal of success, but finding a place as the local enfant terrible of domestic Utah politics. He died on December 17, 1891, and was buried at Fort Douglas 3 years before his opposing commander, Chief Sagwitch. While Connor remained in Utah for the duration of the Civil War, he kept up his antagonism of the Mormons, which in turn prolonged the antipathy between them and the federal government. This meant the Mormons had something in common with the Shoshone, who in 1873 responded to a vision experienced by a sub-chief of Sagwitch's band, prophesying a visit by 3 men who would declare that the Mormon God was the true God. This, it was divined, was a call to action for the Shoshone to be baptized into the Mormon faith, abandon their ancient ways, and learn to build houses and cultivate the soil. This, in many respects, echoed the response of native peoples around the world experiencing the collapse of their traditional societies under the advance of European religion and culture. The promise of paradise, upon pain of conversion, seemed attractive to many in the face of earthly destruction, and Christians and other missionaries around the world reaped a bounty of pagan souls during this period. In the spring of 1873, Sagwitch and his followers were baptized into the Mormon faith. Over the next 4 years, over 1,200 Shoshone were baptized in the Bear River, and gradually they began to adapt to a new lifestyle. It is difficult to read the eulogistic reports of this process that the Mormon Church has published over the years without feeling a small amount of cynicism. But in general, it seems that those natives who were baptized became devout and loyal Mormons, and they experienced better than the hundreds of thousands of others condemned to sterile lives on reservations. A year after the Bear River Massacre, the Sand Creek Massacre took place in the Colorado Territory, claiming the lives of hundreds of natives. In 1870, the Marias River Massacre took place, and the Indian Wars are often considered to have ended in 1890 at Wounded Knee. Throughout that time, a few eyewitnesses to the Bear River Massacre had their recollections published in newspapers in Utah and California, but most natives said little and avoided the site of the massacre, where bleached bones and shanks of hair clinging to the willow brush could still be found. It was not until 2013 that the Idaho Historical Society began the first systematic archaeological survey to map and preserve what remains of the battlefield. The following year, the Utah State University and the USU Museum of Anthropology also began investigating the site. Archaeological searches turned up a wealth of artifacts not necessarily connected to the battlefield, but of significant interest nonetheless. The debris left behind after the battle would have been significant, not only in the form of human remains, but also the detritus of battle, including some of the thousands of bullets fired, arrowheads, knives, and even rifles and revolvers, not to mention the remains of the 70 lodges reported to have made up the encampment. The precise location of the Shoshone encampment, however, could not be established. The camp seemed not to lie where oral tradition and the few published reports suggested that it should, and archaeologists began to suspect that a shift in sediment, perhaps 500 yards to the south since the battle, explained this. The battle is reported to have taken place at the confluence of the Bear River and Beaver Creek, a small stream now known as Battle Creek, but man-made changes to the landscape have done much to alter the course of Battle Creek in the 150 years since the battle. Moreover, there's no doubt that souvenir hunters and amateur archaeologists contributed to the confusion by removing many of the artifacts lying on the surface. An irrigation diversion channel was constructed in the 1890s, while a rupture of the Winder Reservoir in 1911 washed away and buried much of the camp. A more lasting byproduct of the massacre is also perhaps the most ironic and the most fitting. By the late 1880s, the size of the Fort Hall Reservation, set aside for the Shoshone Bannock tribes, had been reduced by about 75%, with the best land opened up for white settlement. The settlers laid out a town in the district which they named Pocatello, named after the Northern Shoshone chief who led his people onto the Fort Hall Reservation in the wake of the Bear River Massacre. It was a magnanimous gesture, but conveniently it was one that came only after nearly everything the natives once possessed had been taken from them. This has been the Bear River Massacre, the history and legacy of the U.S. Army's most notorious attack on the Shoshone in the Pacific Northwest. Written by Charles River editors. Narrated by Jim D. Johnston. Copyright 2018 by Charles River editors. Production copyright by Charles River editors.
Audible